Hello everyone, my name is Tyler Moore, and today I'll be presenting on my research paper, Machismo Evolves, Analyzing Hispanic Masculinity Through Puig's Kiss of the Spider Woman. I decided on this topic simply because it was the text I was most interested in that we worked with this semester. And I was interested in particular the idea of Spanish machismo and the things that we were getting into at the end of the semester with the nonfiction readings. And then the way I found my way into my specific topic of analyzing masculinity in a Hispanic context, I was actually reading something by Eve Sedgwick. It was called The Epistemology of the Closet. And I'll get to that source a little bit later too, but that was just sort of my driving force as to how I found this topic. So my thesis for this paper was, long-windedly so though, but the developing relationship between the two men exposes the detriment Hispanic masculinity has been to both parties and highlights the benefits of less rigid gender roles. Furthermore, the balanced relations between the two men while they are in isolation with one another normalizes the homosexual relationship and works to define connection and intimacy in a language of traits and expressions, rather than a historic dichotomy of heterosexual pairs. This message places the text against much of Hispanic culture's paradigms and works to redefine masculinity in a form which surpasses its previous limitations. The qualities of Hispanic masculinity do not find their roots in the same fields as other cultures, however. Historical context of these roots are vital to understanding the rise of Hispanic masculinity. So first I'm going to sort of give some background information regarding Spanish machismo and sort of how we got to the place in which Puig's novel takes place. Homosexuality has a long history of non-discussion in Hispanic culture. This has much to do with the importance of machismo to the masculine identity. Richard Basham, in his article Machismo, defines it as a cult of the male. He goes further to say it's characterized by a display of sexual prowess, zest for action, including verbal action, daring, and above all, absolute self-confidence. By adopting the cloak of machismo, Hispanic men established themselves into a secure and dominant tradition. Their social stability and direction allow for their duties of acquiring Hispanic women and establishing a family to be readily clear to them as they grow up. However, Spanish machismo is very, very focused on the Hispanic woman. Marisol Asensio, in her article Machos and Sluts, explores this as the contradictory duality of the Hispanic woman. What this means is that men are charged with the duty of protecting the females closest to them, but then once they're of age, they're actually implored to go out and sort of attempt to seduce the women which other Hispanic men are protecting. So it sort of ends up to be what, like Asensio says, a contradictory duality. So while he attempts to seduce females of less relative importance, Asensio notes, this masculine dualism of predator and protector of females entails classifying females as either good and deserving of protection or bad and deserving of exploitation. The Hispanic female's reduction to this sort of binary fulfillment for machismo illustrates her oppression, but more importantly, her definitive position of the center of Hispanic masculinity. An examination of the Hispanic homosexual can then begin after observing this. The Hispanic homosexual does not have an interest in the essence and driving force that makes up the center of Hispanic masculinity, and therefore he has been unmoored and sent adrift in society. The oppression of the homosexual male in Hispanic culture has been very subtle, however. Laws and regulations against homosexuality have been sort of a secondary defense historically, and the family is often charged with encouraging adherence to traditional heteronormative values. Michel Foucault notes in The History of Sexuality that there is no question that the appearance in the 19th century of a whole species and subspecies of homosexuality made possible a strong advance in social controls into this area of perversity. And what that's explaining is prior to colonization in South America, it was very ill-defined what exactly a homosexual was, because men that engaged in homosexual activities weren't considered homosexual. It wasn't exactly an identifying trait. Contrary to Foucault's claim, though, Peter Siegel in Infamous Desire notes that communities of sodomites existed throughout Brazil and Mexico as early as the 15th century. And this discourse back and forth is a matter of identification. Men in these indigenous communities chose to engage in homosexual activity, but that doesn't necessarily suggest a development of a sexual identity. And it can be reasoned that the homosexual identity did not sort of take and settle in until European colonization developed. Let's see. The portrait of the homosexual, however, is a characteristic of the discourse of the period as we evolve through European colonization. A lot of rhetoric and whatnot is used to prove that the lasting portrait of the homosexual is outlined as a part of cultural and political landscape. And the image that's bolstered around this homosexual is one of contamination and deceit. The homosexual body is often sort of associated in Hispanic culture with dirtiness, perversity, as is sort of usual throughout most cultures. Then with the rise of let's see if I can get this word, modernismo. Modernismo is essentially sort of like the parallel to modernism in the English-speaking world. It was sort of it was an artistic and literary movement that produced decadent and thus threatening. Its art was decadent, excuse me, and because of that, it sort of was associated with the homosexual as being sort of frivolous and conceit. Modernism's erasure of the homosexual at the beginning of the 20th century provided Puig's primary cultural context for the issues he raises in this novel, though. And so the artists that wrote during this time, specifically Rodo and Dario, who were Hispanic artists, they supported this dusty sheet that we have put over the homosexual identity, and that's sort of the culmination of this erasure that was happening in the 20th century. From there, we can go into the text and actually analyze the dichotomies that are created between the two characters. So the feelings of constraint of the machismo's designated roles, Molina actually sees the qualities he idolizes in women as exclusively available to their gender because of this dichotomy. Back to Eve Sedgwick that I mentioned at the beginning in her epistemology of the closet, she notes that sexual orientation, with its far greater potential for rearrangement, ambiguity, and representational doubleness, that would offer the apter deconstructive object. And there Sedgwick is noting that specifically in this text, the idea of sexuality gives Puig a certain opportunity to deconstruct other dichotomies that exist between the characters because sexuality is so fluid. The essential nature of sexual choice is far more difficult to maintain and is continually challenged throughout your life rather than something that's settled into an identity. This ambiguity that Sedgwick describes when dealing with sexuality lays the groundwork for Puig addressing a host of other issues grounded in binary misconceptions. Sedgwick then continues to note something that's called a system of flexible variance, which I use to analyze a lot of things in my paper. And a system of flexible variance is in which no relation between two objects or parties can be simplified into an opposition or dichotomy. So that was sort of the mode in which I sort of analyzed the text. I looked at these dichotomies and I sort of saw where Puig was attempting to deconstruct them. The hierarchies in the novel work to marginalize the two main characters, one for his sexuality and one for his political views. As is evident in Valentin's imprisonment, the political conservative ranks are actually ranked higher in society than the revolutionary. And it's this cultural context that's important because everywhere in the novel you're seeing these power structures play against each other. Furthermore, the imprisonment of Valentin and the severe torture he is subjected to during the novel demonstrate the violent hierarchy of political ideology that exists and privileges the political conservative half. The only way in which the reader can sort of perceive the eventual deconstruction of that hierarchy is by analyzing the others that appear in the novel. So essentially what that means is that you can't actually see the political dichotomy deconstructed until you actually observe the personal relationship between the two characters. Molina is initially exemplified, so that was Valentin, and now Molina is initially exemplified as the victim of oppression caused by exclusive nature of the privilege, meaning he is homosexual and the majority of people are heterosexual. Through the stereotypically feminine traits found in Molina's speech patterns, the reader perceives Molina's otherness even before he specifically mentions to his cellmate of his sexual identity. Again, through his imprisonment, it can be established that half of the hierarchy that Molina is a part of is obviously oppressed. And alongside that, the political conservative and the revolutionary binary, this dichotomy will unravel itself when aligned with the other ones in the novel. The dichotomy that I observed most closely, and that ended up actually deconstructing the rest of them for me, was reality versus fiction. And this one can be very easily noted when you observe Molina telling his stories throughout the novel. It's illustrated by the incorporation of the movie's narrations and the dreams throughout the novel. This narrative activity is both an escape from the harsh environment in which the characters are living and a structural device on the part of Molina. The plots, the characters, and the protagonists, and the conclusions of each film actually mimic the reality from which Molina is attempting to escape. And so one ultimately parallels the other. However, it is difficult to identify a position of privilege in either half of this dichotomy, because by the end of the novel, fiction and reality have become sort of so blended that it becomes nearly impossible to isolate either term, much less to privilege one over the other. Ultimately, though, Molina and Valentin's unique relationship is the catalyst for and the result of all of these plays on dichotomies and leads to their deconstruction. Gradually, Puig works at unraveling these dichotomies. This is achieved through the complex and increasingly familiar relationships between Molina and Valentin, and their individual actions as they follow suit. Puig presents the gradual mutual seduction of both men. Melina seduces Valentine physically through the narration of movies and through his maternal caregiving, whereas Valentine ultimately seduces Melina into acting in his movement through the promises of real love between the two men. Puig thus brings the intertwining of all these dichotomies to a culmination with the ultimate sexual union of Melina and Valentine. Each component of every hierarchy is then personified by the two protagonists, and those are finally destroyed through the acceptance of the innate incompleteness of meaning of each separate piece and their absorption of the others. Once the physical union of Valentine and Melina occurs, the union of all of the other hierarchies that are sort of opposed to each other, so conservative and radical, feminine and masculine, all of these are taken into consideration and deconstructed then, including the oppressor and the oppressed, the conservative and the revolutionary, heterosexual and homosexual, and ultimate reality and fiction as well. With this union and dismantling, the definable variations of masculinity are blurred, and then ultimately the two men are at liberty to define themselves. And that was ultimately my conclusion. Thank you very much.